Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the book, The Only Witness. It is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we'll be speaking with Pedro Peinado. He's a longtime researcher and speaker on the Sudarium of Oviedo and its history. So today will be a little bit different. Instead of the shroud, we'll be talking about the Sudarium, but they are very, very closely related. So with that, let me introduce Pedro. He is a member of the EDICES in Spain, which is the research team of the Spanish Sindonology Center, and he's responsible for mathematical modeling and data analysis. He's a PhD student at the University of Oviedo on the mathematical structure modeled in the Oviedo Sudarium and its correlation with the Turin Shroud. He has a degree in business administration and management, and he has another degree in educational technology from the University of Murcia, Spain. And there are a handful of other incredible accolades that he has as well. And one of those is the National Award for Educational Quality, Giner de los Rios, by the Ministry of Education of Spain. Wow, it's so good to have you, Pedro. So let's get started. So tell us, what is your backstory on the Shroud of
Eh,
Turin and on the Sudarium of Oviedo?
Hola, Guy, encantado de estar en tu canal. Y bueno,
It was at
pues
a certain point
desde
in
que era
my
muy
life,
joven,
when I was at a
siempre tuve
conference put
mucho
on by
interés porque me
Alfonso
gusta
Sanchez
bastante
Urmacia,
la
who has been the person who
sindonología,
has always appeared in
e
my
iba
life on the
siguiendo por lo que
Sudarium
me
of
pareció
Oviedo called
lo
me.
que se decía de
Because
ella,
at this conference by
hasta que en un
Alfonso, he
momento
was a doctor
determinado
in
de
my
mi vida,
city,
en
I
una
became totally
conferencia de
hooked, and from
Alfonso
there,
Sánchez
I
Hermosilla,
discovered
que
what the
sin duda
CES
persona
was,
la que
in English known
siempre
as the Spanish Center of
se ha aparecido en
Sindonology.
mi vida
I had access to
cuando el
scientific
síndrome o el
information which,
sudario de
until
Oviedo
now, as you know, has been
me
mostly in the
llamaba,
media.
pues en una
Sometimes
conferencia de
it's not all
Alfonso
real and it's
Hermosilla,
not
que
all
era
true.
médico en
I
mi
had this
ciudad,
access to
pues me
scientific
enganchó
information from top
totalmente
researchers.
bueno, a partir de ahí
For years I
decidí que
was
era eso,
reading, I was
el
learning,
Centro
until in
Español de
2022 I
Sindonología.
spoke again with
Y bueno,
Alfonso
a
Sanchez
partir de ahí tuve
Urmacia to
acceso a la
propose to
información
him that I
científica.
believed that
Y
mathematics
hasta
could put,
ahora,
as we
como
say in
sabes,
Spain,
los
the
medios de
icing on the cake.
comunicación,
I could
pues
put a
a veces
finishing
no es
touch to
todo
demonstrate
todo
all that was
real.
being
Eh,
investigated about the
y a
Sudarium of
partir de ahí, pues
Oviedo and the
tuve
Shroud of Turin.
acceso a una
And
información
then I
científica
began to
de
investigate in a
manos
much more
de
intense way with
investigadores de primer nivel.
EDICES,
Y
with
bueno, a partir de ahí,
first-hand
durante años
materials, with
estuve
first-hand
leyendo
facsimiles, and with
y estuve
first-hand photos.
acercándome hasta que en
During these 2
2022 ya,
years,
de
since I am
nuevo,
in
quedé con
EDICES, we
Alfonso
have
Sánchez
advanced a
Hermosilla
lot,
para
especially in my
proponerme
work of
que
mathematical
creía que las
correlation that comes from
matemáticas
the hand of Juan
podían
Manuel
poner,
Miñaro,
como
without whom
decimos
my
en España, la
mathematical work
guinda
would
al
not make
pastel,
any sense, and
¿no?
also always with
Podía
the
poner,
confirmation of
bueno,
Alfonso
un
Sanchez.
broche para que
Here there is a triangle
demostrar
where
todo lo
anthropology,
que se estaba
legal, and
investigando
forensic
sobre
medicine
el
and
sudario de
mathematics have come
Oviedo y la
together, and we are
sindonología.
bringing to
Y
light
desde entonces
many
empecé a
very
investigar de
interesting
forma
things.
bastante
I have
más
my doctorate in
intensa
educational
con el
technology, but
EDICES,
this
con
year I
materiales de
ventured to
primera
start a
mano,
thesis on the
con
Sudarium of
facsímiles de primera
Oviedo and its
mano, con
correlation with the
fotos
Turin
de
Shroud.
primera mano
In
y bueno,
addition, my mathematical
durante
work is
estos dos
proving what
años,
the
desde que
EDICES
estoy
has
en
been
el EDICES,
arguing for
pues
more than 30
hemos avanzado
years.
mucho.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's always interesting to hear how people get involved with the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo and but so tell us, your interest is in the Sudarium of Oviedo. Tell us what
Ujú.
the Sudarium is.
En ese
We
capítulo
believe
habla
the
de los
Sudarium of
enemigos que
Oviedo
están
is the cloth that
allanados
John
abajo,
mentions
puesto
in
que el
chapter
sudario pues
20.
dice
In
que
that chapter, he
estuvo
speaks
sobre
of the
su
cloth
cabeza, ¿no?
and that they are lying
Eh,
there. And it's
Creemos
the
que es una
Sudarium
prueba
that
de
he
que la
says was on
sintonía es verdadera,
Jesus'
creemos que
head.
es el
We
complemento
think it's
perfecto.
proof that the Sudarium is true.
El
We
sudario
think it's the
es
perfect
esto.
complement. The Sudarium is a dirty, wrinkled cloth which has no image,
Wonderful.
Es
which
esto.
has some central spots that correspond to the part of the nose and the mouth. As you know, there are traces of a
Mostrarte
lot of blood. It is
algunas
very different
imágenes
from the
para
Turin shroud in
que
that
pues,
it has no
nuestros
image. It
oyentes
is a cloth that only has
vean
bloodstains and it was in
lo que
various
queremos decir.
positions. It was not
Bueno,
until the
dejó el rastro
1960s
de
that Monsignor
muchísima
Ritchie
sangre.
discovered it.
Tiene una
Since then,
diferencia
it
muy
has been
grande con
showing
la
up in
síndrome de Turín.
history.
Es que no
It was
tiene
said that the
rastro.
holy chamber
Es
of the
una tela
Cathedral
que
of
solo
Oviedo
tiene
was the
manchas
Sudarium
y que
Domine, the
estuvo
Sudarium of the Lord.
en varias
For from
posiciones.
the studies of Guillermo Ara,
Hasta
who
los
created the
años 60,
EDICES, to study
Monseñor
what Ritchie
Ricci no lo
said and
descubre.
found it completely
Y
true.
mientras ha estado pasando por la
And from these
historia,
very
bueno,
extensive studies, especially the
se decía que
forensic,
en la Cámara Santa de la
anthropometric,
Catedral de
and
Oviedo
always
estaba el
compared with the
Sudarium
shroud,
Domini,
many of the open
el
questions have
sudario
been
del
answered.
Señor, ¿no? Pero a partir
If
de
you
los
like,
estudios
I
de
will share
Guillermo
my
Ara,
screen and tell you a little bit. This is Monsignor Ricci measuring the cloth. He was the first one to measure it, and he made what we say is a Copernican turn. That is, the Sudarium was exposed, as you see here, in a vertical position. But what Monsignor Ricci says is to turn the Sudarium, and therefore you now see two faces. This is what we call the obverse, what we're seeing here on the screen. And where you see the central spots, which are here and here, in the corner appears what we call the butterfly winged area, which corresponds to the back of the head and these puncture wounds, which we believe match the wounds on the crown of thorns. Subsequently, we can see how the face of the Turin shroud fits perfectly with the face coming out of the Sudarium of Oviedo. This is the image of the bloodstains superimposed on the Turin shroud, and we believe it was in three positions, at least in three positions. The first position, with the body upright, that's how the stains we see here in this part are produced, and that was when the head was down and the blood was falling on top of the Sudarium. Because in that position, that's why it is duplicated. That's why we see the double image here and here. As the cloth was folded, the liquid was transferred from one to the other. Subsequently, the head was placed on the ground, and that's why the bloodstains were formed, that we see here above. The blood fell, gravity reversed, and the whole image that is on the forehead, all the blood that is on the forehead, was formed. Finally, and this is a very recent discovery, Professor Mignara has discovered, well, we already knew that it was knotted in the third position. It was knotted on the head. But Professor Mignara has discovered that the knot was double. And thanks to these marks that we see here in yellow, we see that the image, this is a facsimile that I have back here, that there are several knots on the head so you can see how the marks stay. Obviously, this is not a linen cloth, it is a cloth of another material, but you can see how the wrinkles coincide with the knot that we create. And the third position was the one that it was left lying in the tomb, as John says. Here is a rather old altarpiece where the knotted Sudarium can be seen. We'll look at that later if you like, and then we'll comment on it.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. I'm amazed at the Sudarium and how it overlaps with the shroud. And also, you mentioned that you're into mathematics and analytics, and I'm very interested to hear how that all comes together. That's kind of what I do in my day job as well. So very interesting. So tell us about the correlations between the forensic, anatomical, and mathematical data that would be so difficult to falsify.
The Sudarium is a very complex piece of cloth. We do not know how the image was formed. All the investigators of the shroud are in agreement that there is no scientific formation of the image. Let's not forget that we're dealing with a crime here. There are some remains of a crime in that, well, in Spain, forensic studies study the remains of crimes, don't they? Well, to understand the Sudarium of Oviedo, it was essential to make a forensic study that Delphine Villelain began and now is continued by our director, Alfonso Sanchez de Mocia. It is a pleasure to hear him talk about everything that is in the Oviedo Sudarium. We have so much forensic evidence that relates it to the shroud, it is fantastic. There is presence of LOE, there is presence of mural in the blood united with the blood, which is the important thing. The blood is also type AB. Later on, we will talk, if you like, about the anthropometric correlations in mathematics. But forensically, there is a very important amount of science, and it is the throwing of the side. In the Sudarium, in this part, Alfonso Sanchez de Omocia found fibrin. The fibrin, he could explain it better. I'm a mathematician, I am not a doctor. But the fibrin only makes sense to be in that position if there is an exit wound of the internal organs. So, a few years ago, they presented at an international congress and showed it is on the back, and it matches what's on the shroud, the exit wound from the Roman spear. Once the shroud is understood, it is very important to start with the anthropometry. Ritchie began by looking at the measurements of the head and saw that they were the same distance. But this has evolved until Juan Manuel Muraro, masterfully, with a study of both the shroud and the Sudarium, has recreated for us what the body is, the man in the shroud. And it's very important because we know that the Sudarium has information. The Shroud of Turin has information on the front and on the back, but the Sudarium also has information on the side. Therefore, Juan Manuel has been able to reproduce his body with all the information, and this has helped us to measure. It has helped me a lot to start quantifying what is missing from the anthropometric work. It is the first to take and analyze forensically everything that has happened both in the head, which can be seen in the sweat and in the body, in the two cloths, then put it together with the anthropometric study of Juan Manuel, then start to derive conclusions like the ones we are having.
Yeah, very interesting. So now you also did some more, well, you obviously went into it in a lot more detail. So tell us about the mathematical and anatomical methods you use to
Mm,
compare the Sudarium and the Shroud?
sí. Bueno,
Yes, well, there is a first mathematical study that's
hay un
very
primer estudio
interesting.
matemático
Alfonso
muy
Sanchez and I have
interesante
studied the points of coincidence in the Sudarium
Alfonso
of
Sánchez y
Oviedo,
yo hemos
in the Turin
estudiado
Shroud, and in
las
the historical
coincidencias que
figure of
hay
Jesus of
en el
Nazareth.
sudario de
So
Oviedo,
far, we have
en la
45 points
Sindonology de
of
Turín
coincidence are
y en la
common
figura
to both.
histórica de
So the
Jesús de Nazaret.
probability that there
Llevamos
is a
hasta ahora
person who meets these characteristics is
15
at the level of
características
2.22 per 10
son
raised to the
comunes a
minus
todos.
14.
Pues la
We believe that a
probabilidad
forger
de
who
que
wanted
haya
to
una
paint in the
persona
century could
que
paint well.
cumpla
We know
estas
that painting is
características
not possible because
está
in the
del nivel
Sudarium
de
there is no painting,
2,22
neither in the
por 10
Shroud,
elevado
and
a
whoever wants to
4.
falsify the Turin Shroud has it very difficult, because he would
Creemos,
have to
por lo
know
que
the Shroud of
hablábamos
Turin on one
anteriormente,
hand and the
que un
Sudarium on the other hand.
falsificador que quisiese
Mathematics show us that, with a high
pintar en el
probability, that
siglo,
we can
pintar, bueno,
demonstrate that the
pintar sabemos que
Sudarium
no,
and the
porque la
Turin
Sindonology
Shroud
no
and
hay
Jesus of
pintura, ni
Nazareth
Sudarium
with a very
tampoco,
high
y
probability were
que
together, and
quisiese
well, we think it
falsificar
is very
la
important to
Sindonology de
unite
Turín
this
es muy
methodologically,
difícil.
and
Es
that,
muy difícil
well, I
porque
think there
tendríamos
is
que
a
coger
strong.
la
I can go
Sindonology
back
de
to
Turín
sharing
por
my
un
screen if you
lado
like.
y el Sudarium
It
puntos
shows
en
us the
común. A partir
correlation.
de
So
un
with the
agujerito
anthropometric data in
que
this
hay
part, we see
en
the
el
inverted
Sudarium, ese
Sudarium.
agujerito.
Where do we find commonalities? From a little hole in the
Desde el
sweat.
año
That
2022
little
se ha
hole.
venido
Since the
correlacionando todo
year
lo que es la parte de la
2022, we have
frente
been correlating
de
everything that
la
is part of
síndrome
the
con el
forehead of
sudario.
the Sudarium with the
A
sweat.
partir de
From
ahí,
there, both in the front and
tanto
in
por
the
delante
back.
como por
In
atrás,
this
en la
case,
parte
we
de
see the
delante y la
back of the
parte de
neck.
atrás. En
Juan
este
Manuel
caso,
fixed common
vemos
areas
la
that give
parte
us
de la
common
nuca.
points. And well,
Juan
by
Manuel
taking
fijó
measurements and
áreas
placing those points,
comunes
we will leave this for
nos fueron
later,
dando
we have come to see how the
puntos
Sudarium
comunes.
and the Shroud were very
Y
properly
bueno,
wrapping the
haciendo
same head.
medidas.
Wonderful. It's amazing what you're able to do. And so now you use some very specific methodologies. Tell us what your
Mm,
methodology of the study were.
A ver,
Let's see. In this case, the study
en
of
este caso,
mathematics has
el
been
estudio de la
exciting. I have to
matemática
confess that
ha
I'm like
sido
in a
apasionante,
children's playground.
porque
I
bueno,
never
yo
work with
te tengo
images.
que
I work with
confesar
points. I work with
que
coordinates.
estoy
I work with
como
straight lines,
en un
with planes that are
parque
not
de
images.
niños
So in
jugando,
this
¿no?
case, we have to adapt. We have to
Yo
have a lot
ahí
of
no trabajo
creativity and
nunca
adapt methodologies
con
and give it the
imágenes, yo
scientific
trabajo
rigor
con
so as
puntos,
not to
trabajo con
create any
coordenadas, trabajo
hypothesis
con
and no
rectas, con
foundation.
planos, que no
In
son números.
mathematics, we have so many open lines.
Entonces, en
The
este
main one
caso hay
is
que adaptar,
mathematical correlation I wanted to
hay que
show
tener
you
mucha
before.
creatividad y adaptar
So I'm going to
metodologías
continue a bit
y
of screen sharing
darle
so you can
ese
see a
rigor
little bit of what
científico,
we were doing. Once we got the points and
lineales
taking
o
both linear
cuadricularares.
and angular
Así lo
measurements,
hicimos
this is how we did it, and we were taking
y
what
fuimos
are
sacando
called
lo que se llaman
correlations. This is on the
correlaciones.
back
Esta
side.
fue la
This
parte de
is on the
atrás, esto en
shroud,
el
where
sudario,
we kept
¿vale?
measuring by
Donde
dividing
seguimos
the points from
midiendo
center
los
to
puntos
center,
de
and end to
centro
end to
y de
double.
extremo a
In
extremo
this case,
para
triple the
duplicar,
information that we
triplicar
have.
o triplicar la información
And
que
with that
había.
methodology,
Y
we
con
were
esa
taking a very
metodología
large data
fuimos
set and
viendo tanto
establishing
como las
deviations,
desviaciones,
and
tanto
until,
si
well,
dentro
we
del
got to
sudario
some
lo que
correlation
ocurriese
data of
es
0.95
que
as the
esos
standard
puntos
deviations. Both in the
tuvieron el
Sudarium
mismo
and in the
origen.
Shroud, what they tell us is
Es
that
muy
those
difícil
points had the
falsificar,
same
es muy
origin.
difícil
It is
coger
very difficult to falsify
dos
this. It is
cabezas
very
distintas
difficult to
y
take
poner
two
una
different
tele
heads and
que
put a
salga la
cloth and
misma
get the
imagen
same
y que
image and
salgan
get
estos
these
niveles
levels
de
of
correlación.
correlations. So I
Entonces
think we are
creo que
at a
estamos
point
en
where
un punto donde la
mathematics is
matemática está ganando
contributing a lot,
pulso
and we will see
muchísimo
this later
y
when we
esto
talk about the
lo veremos
crown of
posteriormente
thorns.
cuando hablemos de la...
Yeah, phenomenal. It's interesting how high those R squareds are. That the R squared is a pretty good
Sí.
measure of how accurate the model is between the dots that you're looking at, and to have an R squared that is that high in both cases is pretty good. Fascinating. So tell us what your premise is now concerning the shroud and the Sudarium and the crown of thorns.
Before I talk about the crown of thorns, I
Previamente,
want to
antes de
tell
hablar
you
de la
that
corona de
once
espinas,
we have established
quiero
the correlation, we
decirte
apply what is called the
bueno, que
dermatoglyphic
nosotros una vez
methodology.
que
This
hemos
methodology, what it
establecido la
does is
correlación,
the study of fingerprints to
aplicamos lo
know
que
if
se
two
llama
people
la
are the same.
metodología
We have taken 8 points
morfoscópica.
on the head, 8
La
points on the
metodología
forehead, and
morfoscópica
we
lo que
have
hace es el estudio
studied
de las
this
huellas
so-called
dactilares
fingerprint.
para saber si dos
With
personas
correlation, we
son
are
la
talking
misma.
about a very high
La
R
huella dactilar
squared, and we have
estudiada
attained
por
results
una
that any
cara
judicial system
pseudoevropea.
in the world,
Nosotros
any judge
hemos
seeing the
cogido
data that we give,
8 puntos en la
would give us
cabeza,
for sure that
8
the
puntos en la
Sudarium and the
frente
Shroud were
y
wrapped
hemos
around the same head.
estudiado
Usually 8 points is
esa
enough to
correlación a
identify
través
two fingerprints,
de lo
but
que
in our
hablábamos
case,
del
we have
error
looked
cuadrado
for 8 points
cuántico.
on the front and 8
Y
points
nos ha
on the back,
salido
when a fingerprints
unos
analysis is only looking
resultados
for
que en
9 points
cualquier
on one
sistema
side.
judicial
And
del
well,
mundo,
now I'll tell you
cualquier
about
juez,
it. From there,
viendo
we
los datos
continue
que le damos,
investigating and we continue
nos
looking
daría
at the
como por
subject of the crown
seguro
of
que
thorns. I thought you can move into space what we have in the two
Habitualmente
dimensions.
con 8 puntos,
So
eso es
I'm going
suficiente
back to
para
screen
el
sharing.
requisito que sos
This, I
concluir.
jokingly say to
Porque
Professor
es más
Mignaro, this
exacto,
is
las
more beautiful
matemáticas
than his sculpture,
son,
because it's more
son,
accurate.
bueno, para ser muy
Mathematics as
pasadas.
well. For me, a
Entonces
joy,
se
isn't it?
ríe. Lo que
It
estamos
is the
viendo
back of
aquí
the
es
wounds of
la
the
parte de
shroud that
atrás
follows
de
a
la
tendency
extremidad
that
del
we have
sudario que
superimposed on
sigue
the Turin shroud,
una
and as
tendencia
you
que a
see, it
partir de
follows the
esa
same structure
tendencia
of points
nosotros
that
la
there
hemos
is in
superpuesto con
one
la síndrome
cloth
de
as
Turín
in
y
the
como
other.
ves
Subsequently, the parabola, we have taken it to through three-dimensional space, and we put it on the head, and we measure both vertically and horizontally this area. Once we've taken it
Esa
there,
parábola la hemos
point
llevado al
cloud, we
espacio
described it with a
y la hemos puesto
mathematical
sobre la
formula,
cabeza
and we've been
y hemos
calculating depth
medido
until we
tanto
already have the
vertical
crown of thorns
como
behind and in front.
horizontalmente
This from above,
esta
as seen from above
zona,
the
¿no?
points of the crown of
Una vez que lo
thorns
hemos
in the
llevado
Sudarium
ahí,
and in the
esa nube de
shroud.
puntos la hemos
And this
situado
is
con
part
una
of in the
fórmula
front that
matemática
is
y hemos
basically
ido
made with the same
calculando la
stitches of the
profundidad hasta que
Sudarium,
ya tenemos
because in the
la corona de
Sudarium there is
espinas
a
por
very
detrás
open
y por
stain.
delante.
So, well, finally, this is a cloud of dots that we are working
Esto
on.
es desde
We're
arriba,
working,
vamos a
and
ver
when
desde
you adapt
arriba
a
la
little bit
corona de
the view
espinas
that's there, you
que
see
hay
that in
en el
this
síndone
case,
y el
for
sulfario,
example, right now
desde
we're
esa
facing
parte
the front
delante
and we're seeing the front part right
que
now, and how the crown
fundamentalmente
of
se ha hecho
thorns
con,
is
con
rotating
los
around the
puntos de
head.
la síndone
In
porque en el
blue are the
sudario
spots of the
hay una
shroud, in
mancha
red are the
muy
spots of the
abierta.
Sudarium.
Entonces,
So,
bueno,
well, that
finalmente
is a little bit the idea that we have of the crown of
es
thorns, and that surely in St. Louis we will have it be more
la nube de
advanced.
puntos.
Yeah, absolutely. So, wow, that's it's so fascinating, and I would never have thought how difficult it would be too to get the 3D part of it. And I love your animation there. And so one of the big questions on the shroud and on the Sudarium is, are they counterfeit? Are they real? But if the both of them kind of pass together, then that's one good reason
Ujú,
why they're both probably with a high probability,
ujú,
not fakes. So tell us some of the
ujú.
other curiosities or particularities that you show the naturalness and make it difficult for a possible counterfeit.
Yes,
Bueno,
absolutely. We'll
yo
have it more
voy a
events,
contarte
whether they're
tres.
counters or whether they're real. But if
Eh,
both are passed together, then that's a
yo
good
creo
reason why both are
que hay
probably,
que
with a
tener en
high
cuenta
probability, not
que es
fake.
imposible que
Well, I'm
síndone y
going to tell
sudario
you
tengan
three.
las
I think
mismas
that it is
distancias,
impossible that the
porque son
Shroud and the
dos telas
Pseudarium have the
que
same
han
distances because they
sufrido
are two closets that
avatares
for different
distintos en la
histories, and one
historia
was
y
pressed
que
very tightly on
tuvieron
the head
una
and the
muy
other one
presionada
was a
en la
bit more
cabeza y la
loose.
otra cayó.
So, we have
Entonces
already
nosotros ya
calculated
hemos
the systemic
calculado
error.
que
A
el error
minimum error that is
sistémico,
around
un
14%.
error
Well, when we
mínimo que
made
hay,
this
está entre el
comparison of the
14 y
crown
el
of thorns,
100%.
Professor Mignor and
Bien,
I asked him to measure a sculpture from
cuando
here to
hemos
here
hecho
and from
esta
here to here,
comparación de
the
la
same as
corona de
I have
espinas
measured
del
in the
profesor
three-dimensional
Miñarro y
point cloud.
el profesor
Do you know
Miñarro,
what
yo
the
le pedí
difference
que hizo
is?
escultura y
2%.
hiciese
We are
desde
almost totally
aquí
adjusting what the
y aquí,
distances
igual
are,
que yo
and
he
we are
medido
very
la nube de
surprised
puntos
that
esa.
that happens, and
Pero la
that is very
diferencia, ¿sabes
difficult to
cuánto es?
falsify.
Un dos
We
por
will
ciento
present this in
Estamos
St. Louis, both
casi
Professor Mignaro and
ajustando
myself, by
totalmente lo
different
que son las
methods.
distancias.
And
Y
there
estamos
came
muy
a time
sorprendidos
when
del
we got in
proceso.
touch,
Y
and as
eso
we
es muy
usually talk a
difícil
lot,
de
we said to
falsificar.
each other, I have seen this, and I had said,
Segunda
Juan
cuestión,
Manuel,
y
I've also
lo
seen this.
comentaremos en
When
San
we got together in
San
Seville,
Luis,
Alfonso
tanto
was
el
thrilled to
profesor
see
Miñarro
that
como
these points
yo,
coincided
por métodos
exactly. And
distintos,
the funniest, but very
hemos
nice, I think, is that
localizado
when we were
una
doing the
V y una Y
correlation
que hay
points
en la
of the
síndone,
forehead, points
en el
3 and 8
sudario,
of the
en dos
forehead,
caras
I got to the point where I was
distintas
absolutely
por dos
desperate
métodos
because they did
distintos.
not come
Y
out
llegó
within
un
the model
momento que
that
nos
followed the
pusimos en
rest of the
contacto
14
y
points.
como habitualmente
And I
hablamos
measured
mucho,
again
nos
and
dijimos,
again,
yo he
but there
visto
was always a
esto,
deviation until I
y
called
yo le
Juan Manuel
dije,
and I
Juan
told him that
Manuel,
these
yo
points are
también he
wrong.
visto esto.
They
Y
cannot
cuando
be
nos
wrong,
encontramos en
and Pedro
Sevilla,
told me to call
Alfonso se
Alfonso because
emocionó
I think there is
al
a
ver
very
que
big
yo
challenge
decía
there. I
exactamente
called
eso que
Alfonso and I
exactamente.
told him that
Y la
points
más
3 and 8 are
graciosa,
wrong and the distances are
pero muy
greater than I
bonita,
think.
creo yo,
Pedro
es
says
que
there
cuando
is a
estábamos
very
haciendo
big
los puntos
difference,
de
and this is
correlación del
wonderful.
frente,
Even the
los
error of the
puntos
mathematical
3 y 8
model
de la
confirm the
frente,
naturalness of the
yo
process
llegó un
because it is true
momento
that the
que
forehead was
estaba
not
absolutamente
measured like that.
desesperado
The
porque
differences were
no
due to a large
salían
amount of
dentro del
swelling.
modelo,
Then, even the
seguían el
measurements
resto de
that
los
distorted the model
acontecimientos.
confirmed to
Y
us
yo
the
medía
naturalness
una
of the
vez
process.
y otra vez,
How can it
volvía a
be that a
medir y
falsifier could
siempre
reach those
salía una
levels?
desviación.
It
Hasta
clearly
que
does not hold
llamé a
up
Juan
under any
Manuel y le dije, Juan
circumstances
Manuel,
mathematically to show
estos
that the
puntos están
Sudarium
mal,
and the
no pueden
Shroud
ser, no
wrapped in
pueden
the
ser.
same head.
Y me dice
So it's
Pedro,
like a legacy
llama a
that he made for
Alfonso
us.
porque creo
He
que
left
hay
it
una
to us to
instalación muy
show
potente.
that those two kinds, the
Llamó a
Oviedo
Alfonso,
Sudarium
le
and the
digo,
Turin
Alfonso,
Shroud, have to be
me
real and
ocurre que los
authentic for the
puntos 3 y
reason
8
of the crown
salen,
of thorns
me
and other
salen
things
mal
that
y
occurred.
salen distancias.
It's interesting how you talk about that, but I was just as you were talking, I was thinking about the crown of thorns, and how that was so painful for anybody, and especially Jesus, to have on his head, and yet now you are going to use those mathematically to kind of prove that the shroud and the
Mm.
Sudarium are actually one and the same, and so it's kind of like a legacy that he was able to leave for us to show that those two cloths, the Sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin, have to be real and authentic. because of the the crown of thorns and other things that came out of it. Pedro, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. And we're going to meet face to face in St. Louis next year. We have the 2025 Shroud of Turin International Conference and Symposium coming up. That'll be the end of July. You can find out more information about that at shroud2025conference.com. And hopefully, for the listeners out there, you'll be able to attend and see Pedro and many other speakers that we've got that are going to be there. Pedro, thank you so much. People can reach you, I think, at www.edices.es, and find out more information about the study of the shroud, and of course now the study of the Sudarium. Anything else you'd like to add?
For me, it has been a pleasure, and thank you very much that you have thought that my work is important and hopefully continue to dismantle the fallacy that is only supported by carbon-14 and by people who want to destroy a scientific study. What do? We scientifically study the Sudarium as well as the Shroud of Turin, and we want to demonstrate that they are scientific archaeological objects that correspond to historical truth, nothing more.
Fantastic. Well, Pedro, thank you so much. And to the audience, please stay tuned for many other videos in this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And please visit GuyPowell.com and sign up for more episodes. And if you like this one, please rate it with 5 stars. Thank you. Pedro, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias a ti, Guy.